Good morning. How's everybody doing today? Thank you all for coming out on this very rainy, not very pleasant day, and for being here. Today we're going to talk about, the topic is Hollywood Jesus. What has Hollywood done to my Lord? You know, or for those of us of a certain age, it's kind of like, look what they done to my song, Ma. Anybody remember that, or am I just a real dinosaur? Okay, so you can see these are some of the things that have been done to Jesus. You might have a favorite as you look, across the list of things. Wayne just brought to my attention there was another movie called Jesus of Montreal, which was also kind of a very unusual treatment of Jesus, and some of these that we're going to talk about today are also. So we're going to move kind of fast, but if you have a question, please do not hesitate to ask. Before Hollywood, Jesus was being marketed. I hate to use that term, but that's sort of what happened. If you go into a synagogue, you will not see a portrait of God. You will probably not even see a portrait of Moses, because the Jews always had a very, very strong law that you did not picture God, because to do so was to create an idol. And they were very big on not having idols. So in the early Christian church, we think of ourselves as the inheritors of the Jewish tradition, and that's true, but we also inherited a lot of the Greek pagan tradition, because pretty quickly within that first generation, Christianity, as we all know, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 135 AD, and Christianity kind of moved into Greece and Italy and adopted some of the Greek ways, and one of those things was to picture Jesus. These are fairly early images of Jesus, and we'll talk about them as we go along. The early, excuse me, the pollen has got me really crazy. The early images of Jesus often pictured him as what we call Christus Pantocrator, which means Christ the ruler of the world. And so these are some images. Most of them are mosaic. This is an icon here. Oh, I keep forgetting I've got this thing. These are all mosaics, and this is an icon. And the whole idea was that Christ the judge, Christ the king, Christ the ruler. And as you can see, he's not a really friendly looking guy. This guy, I don't know if I'd want to invite him to dinner or, have a beer with him. But that was what people wanted, and that was the kind of image of Jesus that was popular. We're going to see how that changes pretty radically in the Middle Ages. When Francis of Assisi came along, he completely changed our idea of Jesus. After Francis, we know, because Francis was enormously popular, enormously well-known. Even in his lifetime, he was revered. So, and this is kind of gross, I'm going to apologize for giving you something gross to think about early in the morning, but when Francis of Assisi died, they were trying to bring his body back to Assisi, and the peasants tore his body apart to have a relic, because any piece of a dead saint was, a class A, number one, first class relic. If you couldn't get part of their body or a tooth, you could get a piece of their clothing, which was a second class relic. But in any case, what happens after Francis is that we begin to see Jesus, we get this emaciated image of Jesus. Before Francis, Jesus was strong and powerful and kind of a Marvel superhero kind of guy. After Francis, we get and in a lot of ways it was good, because Francis gave us a humble view of Jesus, and a view of Jesus as caring for the poor and caring for the marginalized. So now let's move up to the Shroud of Turin. Has anybody here seen the Shroud of Turin? They drag it out every 20 years or so and put it on display. This is what the face of Christ looks like on the shroud. The shroud, there's a lot of controversy about it. You can't trace it back any further than about 1300. There's no record of it being anywhere before 1300, but in 1300 it shows up in Italy. And we are told that it is the cloth that Jesus' body was covered with. Now, they've done it goes back and forth. They've done DNA testing, they've done radiocarbon testing. One test shows that it's only 700 or 800 years old, but recently they did another test and said, no, that other test was contaminated because at one time there was a fire in the church where it was kept, and the smoke got into it. So the new tests confirm that it's from the 1st century AD. So it kind of goes back and forth. Anyway, this is the image of the face, which for a long time just kind of seemed kind of weird. And then in the 1800s, photography was invented. And an Italian photographer took a picture and was developing it, and he got a negative. And suddenly the negative looks a whole lot more like Jesus, which adds to the whole mystery, because if this was created in 1300 by a forger or a scam artist, there was no awareness of negative imagery. Nobody had ever done negative imagery. How would they know? What would make them think, well, I'm going to do a negative of his face rather than a positive? So it's a very mysterious thing. Here is an image, a painting kind of taken from the shroud. So this, according to the shroud, this is what Jesus looked like. Now, it gets really interesting here as we see, because the shroud, just like Francis, the shroud heavily influenced our image of Jesus, because this got around, even though travel was difficult in the Middle Ages, it got around pretty quickly. Now, there's an image of a picture of the shroud being on display, and like I said, they'll bring it out every 20 years or so. There's a painting that we can see the influence of the shroud. There's Jesus of Nazareth, the 1977 TV miniseries by Franco Zeffirelli. You can see again a similarity. There's The Greatest Story Ever Told, which was, I think, in the 1960s or early 70s. There's The Passion of the Christ, Mel Gibson's film. And you can see that, we have clearly been influenced by that concept and that image of Christ. So Hollywood decided they would take not a turn, but many, many turns at depicting Jesus. And they have gone the gamut from super orthodox, devout, overly devout, to kind of radical impressions of Jesus. Again, you might want to look at some of these and think, which one have you seen? We'll kind of go through them one by one. First of all, there were actually some depictions of the life of Christ in the silent era. These, unless you're a real film buff, have not been around. Has anybody seen any of these? No, they're not great even as silent movies go, because they were kind of early and kind of primitive. And then there's some movies, I call these the unseen Jesus, because they're movies where Jesus plays a part, but Jesus is never seen. Anybody seen Ben-Hur? Yeah. Who saw it in a theater when it first came out? Yeah, you have to be of a certain age to have seen that. Ben-Hur that's Charlton. Oops, I got to go back. What happened? That's Charlton Heston, right there, in his youth. And Ben-Hur is the story of, in Ben-Hur, by the way, it was the first CinemaScope production that was about Jesus. Jesus is only seen from behind, or sometimes you see his shadow. But it's really the story of a Jewish guy named Ben-Hur who ends up being a chariot racer and is influenced by Jesus in a kind of backwards way. Okay, The Robe, and that is Richard Burton, also very young. Did anybody see The Robe? Okay, yeah. Again, in The Robe, we see his feet, and we see, I think there's one other image of him, but you never see Jesus' face. And it's about, we've all heard, you know the story that at the crucifixion, the soldiers cast lots for his robe. And so this is a movie based on like what happened to that robe. And Richard Burton is the guy who got the robe. And then, he just thought, hey, I got a cool robe, maybe I can sell it on eBay or something. And but then it turns out transforming his life because it was a Class 1 relic. Okay, let's move on. King of Kings, 1961, early. Who saw this? Anybody see this? Yeah. This was one of the first big full color images, probably the first big screen Technicolor blue-eyed Jesus, played by Jeffrey Hunter. European audiences said he looked too suburban. And I think they're kind of right, he looks like, a guy from California, No, he doesn't look Jewish. He had blue eyes, but he was handsome, and it was a very popular movie at the time. Okay, now we jump into 1974 with Jesus Christ Superstar. Who saw that? Come on, admit it. Superstar gets a lot of flack, which I think is undeserved. It's the story of Jesus in rock music. It's a rock opera. It's composed through, which means it's music from the beginning to the end. There are no spoken lines. It's it's a rock opera. That's what it says. It was interestingly, you might not know this, it was originally written as a concept album. A concept album is an album that Andrew Lloyd Webber had no intention that this would ever be done on stage or as a movie. It was just a concept album, and you can take liberties with a concept album, which is why Judas sings a big song after he dies, because you can do that in a concept album. It creates problems when you're trying to do the play or do a movie, And often they have Judas singing from heaven or from beyond in some way. The story here is it's the view of Jesus through the eyes of Judas. And Judas is doubting Jesus, and he's a follower of Jesus, but he thinks that Jesus is going to get them all in trouble and the Romans are going to arrest them all. And so it kind of goes through his whole thing. It also gives us a very human view of Jesus. When you see him in the Garden of Gethsemane, he has a whole song in which he asks God, "Let this cup pass from me." And I think it's actually pretty good. Ted Neely was probably the most blonde Jesus of all the movies. He looks like a surfer. You could just picture him, with a surfboard under his arm. It's been redone. They've never redone the movie, but they filmed a couple of Broadway versions. The one in 1999 was actually pretty good. Godspell. Who saw Godspell? Admit it. It has not aged well, I'll tell you. When it came out on video, my oldest daughter, who's now in her 40s, was about, I guess, 15 or 16, and I'd seen this when I was in college, and I liked it, and I said, "Oh, you're going to love this," and I put it on, and like 5 minutes into it, she goes, "Dad, really?" The whole idea here is that Victor Garber plays Jesus. You might remember him. He played Daddy Warbucks in the first movie of Annie. And he leads a troupe of clowns through New York telling the story of the gospel. Now, Godspell was actually written by a devout evangelical Christian, and it was done as a play. It works better as a play than as a movie, because during the Last Supper scene, they actually passed out cups of wine to the audience, and it was, so it was kind of interactive. As a movie, it's kind of weak. In the play, the clowns are all hanging out in a junkyard. We're never given a reason for that. And also, I should point out that in the early 70s, there was sort of a thing about clown ministry. Was anybody here ever involved in clown ministry? Thank you. It was kind of a thing, and it made sense.
I had nuns that were clowns with me.
You what?
There were nuns. We went to clown school.
Nuns?
Yes, there were nuns.
Yeah, people were into clown ministry. You could do a story of the Saint Nicholas or Saint Francis, and it was told as clowns. It just doesn't seem to warm the cockles of people's hearts these days. Tidbit, little fun fact, this dance, I think that's We Can Build a Beautiful City, and they're dancing all over New York, but this part of the dance, they're dancing on the roof of the World Trade Center, which is kind of weird. Jesus of Nazareth, 1977, it was the first big TV production. Who saw Jesus of Nazareth? Nobody? Nobody wanted to invest 6 hours? I mean, Paige, but nobody else? Yeah. It's really well done. Franco Zeffirelli, the guy who directed Romeo and Juliet, the 1968 version, did this. The rumor was that he was granted, I guess because he was Italian, I don't know, he was granted access to the Vatican Library, to secret files of the Vatican Library. But you'd never know that from the production because it's just kind of very basic. There's nothing new in the way this is done, but it's very well done. He tried to present the gospel in a Jewish context, and you see Jesus reading the scrolls in the synagogue, But the Jesus still looks really English. I mean, okay, so we moved from blonde to brown hair, but, you know, the guy is like very pale. Doesn't look Middle Eastern at all, and had blue eyes. And as one of the girls I was friends with said at the time, I said, what did you think about it? She goes, that was pretty good. I mean, Jesus had bedroom eyes. I said, bedroom eyes? She goes, yes, in Zeffirelli, everybody's got bedroom eyes. Once you have heard that, you can never unhear it. You know, go back and watch the life of St. Francis. St. Francis has bedroom eyes. You know, even as a child, St. Francis has bedroom eyes. So it's good, I will say, but you got to be willing to invest 6 hours in it. It was shown over 6 nights when it first released. The Jesus Film Project, 1979. Has anybody seen any of this? It's kind of interesting. It's the Gospel of Luke verbatim. The only words in this movie are the Gospel of Luke, which is an interesting idea. I mean, nobody can argue with it, but it comes out really stilted because the writers of the Gospel really had they didn't write a history, and they certainly didn't write a novel. They were writing an argument to convince people that Jesus was the Messiah. So they kind of used shorthand. They kind of, gave just a few of the facts. When you see this in a movie, I was kind of excited when I heard about it. I thought, oh, this will be really cool. When you see it, it's a little weird. Here's these fishermen fishing in their boat, and suddenly they look up and there's this guy standing on the shore, and he goes, "Come, follow me." And he turns around and walks away, and they all climb out of the boat, and it's like mass hypnosis or something. So I didn't think personally I didn't think it was very effective. Jesus still looks very English, or maybe from New England or something like that. Over 6 billion viewings occurred of this. Life of Brian. Now we're really getting into it. Who saw Life of Brian? Nobody. Nobody saw Life of... Wayne, you saw Life of Brian? Connie? Okay. Anybody else? You're among friends. Okay, Life of Brian was Monty Python's... the story behind this is that they did a movie called The Holy Grail. Who saw Holy Grail? Wow, nobody, no Python fans here. Oh, this is going to be tough. I'm in a tough spot here, tough audience. Okay, they did a movie called The Holy Grail, which was, making fun of the whole Arthurian legend. And when they were being interviewed afterwards, somebody said, "What are you going to do next?" And Eric Idle kind of just spontaneously said, "I think we're going to do something about Jesus." And he was just kidding, but then they kind of talked about it, and they said, well, we can't do anything about Jesus. We will be, no pun intended, crucified. But, so they decided to do a movie about a guy named Brian whose life kind of curiously parallels Jesus. He's born at the same time, but he's born in a different manger down the street from the main manger. And this is the way the whole movie is treated. You only see Jesus once, and you see him on top of the hill preaching, and it's a very traditional, devout-looking Jesus with the robes, and he's saying, "Blessed are the meek." And then the camera pulls back and you see the crowd in front of him, and the camera pulls back and you see more crowd, and the camera pulls back and you see more crowd. And it pulls back to the point where Jesus is maybe 300 yards away, and you're at the very back of the crowd. And the people are going what did he say? I don't know, I can't understand it. I think he said, "Blessed are the cheesemakers." Well, what's special about them? So It's funny, and it is not blasphemous. They do not treat Jesus in any disrespectful way. They took great pains to avoid doing so. Brian is born, and he gets involved, and he's involved in a liberation group that's trying to overthrow Rome, and then in the end he gets arrested, and he does get crucified at the end. Somehow they try to make crucifixion funny. I don't know if they succeed or not. That part was always a little weak for me, but some parts of it are hilarious. There's one scene where one of the members of his group scrawls an anti-Rome message on the wall of a temple, and a Roman soldier catches him and says, "You misspelled that. Now write it again 100 times." And you see the temple with this anti-Roman message all over it 100 times. Interesting viewing, not for the faint-hearted. Okay, The Last Temptation of Christ, another edgy treatment. Who saw this? A few people. Very interesting. Martin Scorsese did it in 1988. And the whole film answers the question, what if Jesus had refused to die? We know that in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus asked God, please, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. And so this is, and again, this gets a lot of flack, like, oh, blasphemous. They did horrible things with the story of Jesus. And it's like, if you watch it, no, they did not. The way it works is that you see Jesus getting arrested, you see Jesus up on the cross, and then an angel appears to him and says, God has sent me to tell you that you've accomplished your mission. You've proven your faith. You've accomplished all that you needed to accomplish. You don't have to go through with this. And so you see Jesus get down off the cross. The movie never questions Jesus's position as Messiah or even his position as Son of God. So in the movie, Jesus gets down off the cross and walks away and goes on and gets married and has children and grows old and has a normal life. And then as an old man, he's like kind of on his deathbed, and you're kind of watching this going like, wait a minute, Jesus is getting married and having kids? That's blasphemy. That's crazy. Well, then at the end, he's on his deathbed, and suddenly you're back at him on the cross. And you realize that was all taking place in his mind. That on the cross, he had, according to Martin Scorsese, he had the thought, I could get down from here, I can do things like that. I could just lead a normal life. And he just thought about it and then decided to go through with the crucifixion. So, so it's very touching in a way. There's some, the one thing that's really bad about this is the guy who plays, I think it's Judas. It's Harvey Keitel, I think. It's somebody with a Brooklyn accent. So that's kind of a little off-putting. But anyway, if you get a chance to see it, I would consider watching it. Of course, now I spoiled the ending for you, but yeah. Going back to a more traditional interpretation, Jesus in 1999. Did anybody see this? It's a mini-series. It was on TV. It was okay. It was Jeremy Sisto played Jesus. It was Italian-American. It was about 3 hours long, so it was always shown 2 nights in a row. And those things never do well. That's kind of why the Last Temptation, the Zeffirelli 6-hour version, because Americans don't, we're so fickle, I mean, it's like, well, I really would like to see this, but I don't know. If I watch the first one, I don't know, I might get invited somewhere interesting tomorrow, so then why start now if I'm not going to finish it? So anyway, it attempted to show a more human side of Jesus while still affirming his divinity. It's not bad. It's just kind of, Jesus is just kind of like a swell guy, and he's kind of what we want him to be, but it's a little bit, he's very American, and, he like sits and chats with people and, gives them a hug and, stuff like that. Okay, speaking of Jesus that's not giving anybody a hug, Passion of the Christ, 2004. Who saw this movie? This movie has also gotten a lot of flack from various quarters. Mel Gibson is the director. He returns to the more medieval focus of Jesus' sacrifice. If you've been in a lot of medieval churches and looked at a lot of medieval crucifixes, many of them are pretty brutal. You see Jesus with blood streaming down his face. Well, that's what Mel Gibson has done here. The interesting thing about this, and I think the thing it'll go down in history for, is that there's no language in this movie other than Aramaic and Latin. Jesus and his apostles and all the people he meets all speak Aramaic. And then when he meets Pilate, he has a conversation with him in Latin, which, okay, Mel, I know you're a big Catholic and everything, and I know Catholics are heavily into Latin, but in the first century, Pilate would not have spoken Latin, and therefore Jesus probably would not have spoken Latin either. Did you have your hand up?
I did. Was Aramaic spoken in a Brooklyn accent, by the way?
Well, good question. Was the Aramaic with a Brooklyn accent? I don't speak Aramaic, so I can't tell if it had a Brooklyn accent. But it's interesting. And, I thought this is going to be so off-putting. I'm not going to be able to follow this movie at all. But once you get into it, I mean, they do have subtitles, so you're not just watching Aramaic. And once you kind of get used to it, it's kind of interesting to see Jesus speaking Aramaic. Jim Caviezel plays the part of Jesus, and he does a pretty good job. Jesus here looks like, he might actually be Jewish. He's still kind of, pale, but, in terms of possibilities, it's pretty good. The show is brutal, I got to tell you. It's brutal, and that's what it got all the criticism for. The flogging of Jesus takes place in real time. You see every one of those lashes. You see him bleeding. You see bits of flesh being ripped away from him, which, didn't really happen, but they did some really good special effects. Yeah?
If they wouldn't have been speaking Latin, what would they have been speaking?
Probably Greek. Greek was the lingua franca. That's kind of a oxymoron. But Greek was the language of the Mediterranean world. Now in Israel, of course, they did speak Hebrew and Aramaic because they were radicals and they hated Rome and they were not going to cave into Rome. But throughout most of the Mediterranean, people spoke Greek. Latin maybe existed, but it was considered a vulgar tongue. This is why in 400 AD, when St. Jerome translated the Bible from Greek into Latin, it was called the Vulgate, because he translated it into the vulgar tongue of the lower class average person. And so, yeah, good question though. Any comments or questions about this? If you have a chance to see it, I think it's very worth seeing. Having seen it, I really don't need to see it again. I was hoping, when I saw it, I was hoping, wow, this is not a bad movie. It would be really good if they edited it and kind of took out some of the brutality, because the rest of it, there are some really beautiful, tender moments there. When you see Jesus instituting the Eucharist in Aramaic, it's kind of touching. There's another scene where Jesus is carrying the cross and stumbles and falls down. And the cross is really heavy, and when that happens, his mother, Mary, sees him stumble, and you see in her mind's eye, she remembers him as a little boy falling down and comforting him. And it's a very touching moment. So all of these, what we have in common here, is that by filling in the gaps in the gospel story, Hollywood has given us a friendlier, more empathetic Jesus. We can relate to this Jesus. I mean, any one of these Jesuses, we can relate to him. We could kind of see ourselves going to him if we knew him. We could see ourselves spending time with him. We can see ourselves loving him, which was difficult when he was Christus Pantocrator. In fact, the whole Christus Pantocrator, Jesus was so inaccessible that people were like, well, I can't pray to him. He's not going to understand me. He's perfect and divine. I know. I'll pray to his mother. She'll go ask him to do stuff for me. I have actually heard Catholic friends of mine say, well, if you want to ask the king a question, you're afraid to go to the king, but if you know the king's mother, you can ask the king's mother to talk to the king for you. Well, as time went by, Mary kind of got inaccessible too, so I know I'll pray to Saint Joseph. He'll go to Mary, and Mary will go to Jesus. These Jesuses are much more accessible. Even the Jesus of the Passion seems like a very warm, friendly, likable guy. And even the productions that are more traditional, like this one, the King of Kings, Jesus doesn't seem very friendly, but he's still kind of a nice person. He's still somebody you might reach out to and spend time with. Okay, we're wrapping up here. Sometimes we made Jesus too friendly. Now, this was a satirical thing that was done in the movie Dogma, where a guy says, we've decided that Jesus is just too serious, that nobody's going to like him. So we have come up with this statue, the Buddy Jesus. They call it the Buddy Jesus. And most of us would not go that far. So here's the Pantocrator, and here's the Buddy Jesus, and where's the real Jesus lie? Hopefully somewhere in between. Recent films about Jesus, The Chosen, which is available on Netflix or one of those. Prime? Yeah, if you want to see this, it's supposed to be really good. It's actually a TV series, so it just started its 4th season.
Well, no.
5th season?
Fifth season isn't released until June 15th on Prime. 6th is being in production now.
Okay, so they're going on with it for a while. So they must not have gotten to the crucifixion yet.
That's 6th.
Yeah, okay. It's actually very good from all that I've heard. This is hot off the presses. It just released in theaters May 1st of this year, last week. It's, as you can see, an animated story of Jesus. Kind of a cool little conceit there. In this movie, Charles Dickens is a young guy, a young father, and he's talking to his son, And his wife says, "You're a good storyteller, Charles. Tell him a story about forgiveness because something happened where the kid didn't forgive a friend," or something like that. So he tells him the story of Jesus, and we see the story of Jesus played out in animated form. This would be a great thing if you're ever babysitting your grandchildren and you tell your kids, "I'm just going to show them a video. It's a cartoon." You know? But I haven't seen it yet. I'm looking forward to seeing it. So, Hollywood Jesus. What might Jesus have really looked like? Very quickly, this is actually a tomb painting of a first century Palestinian. So he might not look exactly like that, but that's sort of what he might look like. This was something that these scientists did where they took the skulls of several Israeli and Palestinian people from the first century and reconstructed a face on the skulls. And so it might be that. This is an image of a current young guy living in the Middle East. So some of these may be what Jesus maybe looked more like. So Hollywood has made Jesus a bit too American, a bit too blonde, a bit too Anglo-Saxon, but has also made him very real for us. We can feel that we know Jesus because of these movies in a way that was difficult before. From distant Pantocrator to a person who's a friend and a brother. So the question I'm leaving you with, yeah, Paige.
I was just going to say, on The Chosen, it was an interesting thing. About a year ago, the actor playing Jesus in there, who's wonderful, had an audience with the Pope, with Pope Francis, and he was out in St. Peter's Square, and some young people were yelling from across the square, "There's Jesus."
That must have been, it's like the Pope brought Jesus to us. Who's Jesus to you? How do you think of Jesus? How do you relate to Jesus? Do you see him as the Good Shepherd? Do you see him as, can you relate to his sacrifice more? Do you see him as a friend? Any one of these. Anyway, that is all we have time for today. And we're done. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Please come back to the